Hello, friend. Thanks for joining me for another book chat. Today, let's spend a few minutes with The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis. This book was originally published back in 1943. I've been meaning to read some C.S. Lewis for quite some time, and this particular book has been referenced in some other books that I've read over the last few years. I was really curious if maybe this book would be anything like the books like The Phenomenon of Man by Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, or The Future of Man by de Chardin as well, or maybe something similar to The Shaking of the Foundations by Paul Tillich, or The Liberation of Life by Charles Birch and John Cobb. You know, these are all books that I've read over the last couple of years and chatted here on my channel. I will link down to those chats down below, but this particular book was not anything like those books at all. It was actually a bit of a rant. So C.S. Lewis goes on a bit of a rant about a textbook. So it all started, I guess, because Lewis had received a complimentary copy of a textbook intended for boys and girls in the upper forms of schools in England. And I'm not really sure what upper forms of school means as far as ages go. I'm not sure because I don't understand that system of forms that they have in England. But nevertheless, it was meant for school kids, this particular textbook. So C.S. Lewis doesn't want to call out the authors of the textbook or the textbook itself, although it's an actual textbook, and I think we now know which textbook he was referring to, but in this book, he doesn't refer to the textbook by name. He calls it the Green Book, and he calls the authors Gaius and Titius. So in the second chapter of this book, Gaius and Titius quote what the author says is a well-known story of Coleridge about a waterfall. Now, well-known story by Coleridge of a waterfall. I'm not familiar with this story, so it wasn't well known to me, but maybe it was well known to educated people in England in the 1940s, perhaps. I guess it must have been. But in this story, anyway, there are two tourists, and they're looking at a waterfall, and one of them says that the waterfall is sublime, and the other one says that the waterfall is pretty. So that's quite a difference, right? If something's sublime versus something is considered pretty. And so Coleridge in the story apparently sides vehemently on the side of the sublime and rejects with disgust the idea that the waterfall is merely pretty. So in the passage from this textbook that gets C.S. Lewis so riled up is this. When the man said, "This is sublime," he appeared to be making a remark about the waterfall. Actually, he was not making a remark about the waterfall, but a remark about his own feelings. What he was saying was really, I have feelings associated in my mind with the word sublime, or shortly, I have sublime feelings. So the waterfall's not sublime, it's that I have sublime feelings. So there's a difference, right? Gaius and Titius, the authors of the textbook, go on to say, this confusion is continually present in language as we use it. We appear to be saying something very appointed about something, and actually we are only saying something about our own feelings. This doesn't seem all that controversial, right? So why did C.S. Lewis get so upset about it? I think he argues in the book that he really gets upset because of the insidiousness of this argument, injecting this sort of idea into a school kid's mental process. He says in the book, the very power of Gaius and Titius depends on the fact that they are dealing with a boy who thinks he is doing his English prep and has no notion that ethics, theology, and politics are all at stake. Wait, now, so we say, wow, we have all that at stake from this one sort of sentence about a waterfall. Well, I think the point is, does sublime exist in and of itself, or is it only our feelings of the sublime? I think that Lewis is arguing that if we erase the idea that sublime actually exists and only accept our feelings as valid, we are somehow diminished, because in this sense, the world loses a bit of meaning. There is no sublime. There's only our feeling of sublime. So once this idea, I think he argues, has taken hold, then meaning from any other experience will erode away, leaving humankind left with only our feelings, right? And in an otherwise kind of meaningless world, the only meaning is how we feel. Lewis argues then that ultimately this would lead to humanity losing meaning even in itself, because if you start stripping away meaning from waterfalls and nature and trees and everything else around you and only how you feel about it, then that can also sort of dehumanize us, right? And hence the title of the book, The Abolition of Man, I think is what he was trying to say. Lewis argues here that there is a way of things. He calls this way, the Tao, like a Tao. Things which have an objective value as opposed to just a subjective value. So an objective value as opposed to just how we feel about something is just our subjective value, right? The waterfall would then only have subjective value, as opposed to if it were truly sublime, it would have an objective value. Lewis argues in this example that there is a right way, the way to experience the world, to experience the waterfall. There's a right way to experience the waterfall, which would be in the way of the Tao, the right way, the way. And the right way is that the waterfall is sublime. So the person who would only see the waterfall as pretty is actually missing something. It's not that the waterfall is pretty to you, but it's sublime to me. The waterfall is sublime in Lewis's view. And he goes on here in the book to say, the man who called the cataract sublime was not intending simply to describe his own emotions about it. He was also claiming that the object was one which merited those emotions. So the object itself merits the title of sublime, not just that I just think it's sublime or I just feel that it's making me feel that it's sublime. It is sublime in Lewis's words. So Lewis doesn't think the authors of the textbook are expressing these ideas in order to do actual harm to school kids. He grants them the benefit of the doubt about that they are just trying to instill sensibility, a sense of sensibility into their students. But Lewis objects to this approach because he says, for every one pupil who needs to be guarded from a weak excess of sensibility, there are 3 who need to be awakened from the slumber of cold vulgarity. The task of a modern educator is not to cut down jungles, but to irrigate deserts. So not to try to take away meaning from their students, but to irrigate it, to create even more meaning for their students so that their world becomes richer, is what I think he's trying to say here. So to me, the ideas in this book are so interesting because they're at the root of a lot of cultural conflicts even today over something as far as being an objective value versus a subjective value. And I just think that's just fascinating. But to bring the conversation back around to the waterfall, if the waterfall is stripped of its status as sublime, then it loses its meaning, and therefore a decision could easily be made to just dam up the river for some economic reason with no loss to us, right? There would be no loss to us if there was no such thing as the sublime. So, think of a waterfall, maybe an unnamed waterfall in a small river somewhere around where you live. It could be... Maybe it is sublime, but maybe it's just pretty. But then think of maybe Niagara Falls or any other major waterfall. Let's just use Niagara Falls as an example, would be sublime. So it would actually diminish us something in meaning, not just environmentally to dam up and just destroy Niagara Falls, because it would be some sort of crime, right? I think most of us would see that Niagara Falls is sublime, and to destroy it would take away something from us. We would be reduced by doing that, by destroying it. But the danger of this kind of thinking that the only value is in our feelings about something is, I think, what Lewis is warning us about here. C.S. Lewis argues here that there is this way, the Tao, and that it can't change. So there is a fundamental values. There's a fundamental system of values like the sublime, the majestic, awe, wonder, these sorts of things, beauty, truth, these sorts of big capital letter concepts that exist, that sort of undermine our reality. We can kind of tinker around at the edges, but any kind of changing, we can't fundamentally change these because they are objective values that exist independently of how we feel about them or how we approach them. And that doesn't mean to say, though, he goes on to say in this book, that moral development isn't possible. I mean, I think it's obvious that it is, and he argues that it is, but we can look at history and see that humanity has had a moral development over the course of centuries, you know, where we used to have infanticide or child labor or status of women or any other number of changes that have occurred where we have advanced ourselves morally. So we're not stuck in a rigid moral system. That's not what he's trying to say here, I don't think. But that change itself has to come from the Tao. It has to come from the way itself. It can't be imposed on it from the outside. So any kind of change, like a secular philosophy or a philosophy in general, can't really change that. If it goes against the Tao, it can't ultimately succeed because it's never going to be able to change that fundamental basis of reality, I think is what he's trying to say. He says, from within the Tao itself comes the only authority to modify the Tao. I just think that's really, really interesting. An example of outside the Tao, I think, is like a law. Like there's this saying, you can't legislate change, you can't legislate morality, you can't legislate that. It's like, I don't murder people because if there's a law against murder. I don't murder people because it would be against the Tao. It would be against the sense of rightness. So that is a case like murder is wrong, not because there's a law that says it's wrong, but because it's fundamentally wrong as an objective value. Life is an objective value. Okay, I think I'll leave the chat there. I just enjoyed reading this so much. I'm still thinking about it. You know, it was pretty easy to read. It's just these ideas around the Tao, around values, objective values versus subjective values, and I found it very fascinating and fun to read. So, yeah, I'm glad I got that read. I will be reading some more C.S. Lewis in the future. However, my next chat is going to be The Great Man Theory by Teddy Wayne, some fiction. And I have finished this already, and I will have a chat on it coming up soon. So until next time, take care. Bye.